it's working. There are 5 of us here, so do we need... join us here today. It is a great pleasure, a great honor to partner with the World Green Economy Organization. This is a relationship for Vertical Future that we established 3 months ago, September-wise. Definitely a means by which we, as Vertical Future, have found a kindred spirit, an organization that has a number of shared values with what we do as a company. And we're obviously incredibly honored to be invited to be here as part of the Blue Zone within COP28. This is our first visit to any of COP-related organizations, and it is incredibly powerful to see the number of people and the extent to which engagement from business, from government, from the NGOs is really making an impact. So it is a great pleasure for us to be here. I'm going to start with some introductions, and then we're going to move on to the topic at hand. If I asked Jamie to first introduce himself and Vertical Future, since he is the CEO and founder of our company, and I'm merely the Chief Commercial Officer of the organization. So Jamie, if you could start with yourself, we'll then go to Professor Gideon, and then we'll start talking about our topic at hand here today.
Thanks very much, Mark, and good to see everybody and everybody who's obviously live streaming. My name is Jim Burrows, and as Mark said, I'm the founder and CEO of Vertical Future. My background's in health economics, and I set up Vertical Future about 7.5 years ago. We're a vertical farming technology and data company, so we're, if you split the vertical farming sector, we're more like the picks and shovels, and the growers are the gold miners, depending on what they're growing. We do all of our technology in-house, and we also manufacture, and we also have a very big software element to the business, and are also very research focused. So leaders in research, members of the World Economic Forum, and other key decision groups. And it's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to be here and join you. We'll be getting an echo from that, I'm not sure where it's coming from. Because it's still being picked up now. It's working just about, isn't it? Yeah. So it's a great pleasure to be here on this pavilion and to join you in Vertical Futures. As someone who's been to COP a little bit more than you, welcome to this jamboree of a climate event. And I'm very happy to see more of the people with the solutions coming to these sorts of meetings, where we're not just thinking of the problem of climate, which we're very well aware of, but also how we might set about solving some of those climate issues. So I'm Gideon Henderson. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And agriculture is clearly a big part of what we do, but also always thinking about the environmental component to that, and some of the technologies that might help us to minimise that environmental footprint are really important to us as we plan for the future.
All right. I'll pass that back across. It is a stat, and I'm sure anybody that's been here for the week is inundated with statistics. But the piece that has really stuck out for me as I've been thinking through our role in that process is 1/3 of global climate emissions are related to agriculture. Yet of the total funding that has been committed to solving our global emissions is down at 1.5% of the total funding needs that are being put into play. That compares with global annual subsidies that governments pay to farming systems in the world of over $600 billion a year. I think the announcements at the beginning of the week amounted to about $200 billion of support related to climate change matters. So that even that is just 1/3 of the total volume that is currently being put towards subsidizing existing farming systems. I would say we as vertical farmers are definitely not putting ourselves forward as being a solution to the entirety of the process, but we can clearly play a role in a number of different components to support that process. So maybe I'll first start by asking Jamie to give a little description. Jamie has been running this business since 2016, about the manner in which he sees vertical farms playing a role in the ability for farming systems to adapt, mitigate and manage some of the effects of climate change. So over to you, Jamie.
Sure, happy to. And obviously this is a topic which I discuss quite frequently, so very used to it. And vertical farming has obviously become a very hot topic across the world in recent years. Maybe if I give a bit of background on how vertical farming has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years. Obviously it's been around a lot longer in different forms, but I'd say we're probably in our third wave of vertical farming in terms of market growth and so on. So I think the last year has been quite challenging because a lot of the initial vertical farming models that were set up on the basis of growing very, very fast and failing fast, and a lot of capital going into them as effectively money-making machines. And the wrong type of capital was going into them, essentially. So PE and VC funding that had, very, very stringent expectations in terms of returns, 3 to 5 year returns, pref share structures, and so on. And I think that that immense amount of pressure for a lot of the companies that we're aware of that have failed, we call them the early adopters, in the US predominantly and also outside the US, obviously has really hurt the sector. So I think that the funding component of it has been an issue and the way that it's been set out. But I think more broadly, and we started out as operators, so on the other side of the coin, growers and servicing restaurants in London and all that kind of stuff. Quite small scale to begin with, and then I think in 2019 we realised that there was no real single one-stop shop solution to effectively provide what's required to scale and for this sector to move beyond premium, leafy greens and microgreens and all the things that everybody's heard about. Addressing food security, which for me should be at price parity. Vertical farming should not be something that is, it just caters for higher income groups and so on. It should be something that provides healthy, nutritious, fresh, local produce that eliminates supply chain issues, eliminates or deals with food safety issues at a very fair price point. So that's kind of how we set about with our model. I think in recent years, there's then, as some of these other companies have failed, there's then been an influx of a lot of other vertical farming companies because on the grower side, there are very low barriers to entry. So anybody can effectively, if they have a bit of capital, go and set up a very small vertical farm or a big vertical farm, depending on how much capital they have, and they can buy the components from different types of suppliers. And we've been through that journey, we did that very early on, and it's not really the way forward. What we've seen in the last year is also a reversion to models that we don't believe work. So these shipping container models, these grow tower models, and similar, where you can't really get the economies of scale. If you put 50 shipping containers next to each other and they're not integrated and so on, you're just basically duplicating inefficiencies. So interestingly, there has been, because of the lack of capital availability in the market and some of the bigger failings, at a time when we need to scale the industry and actually build bigger farms with good capital backing, with good technology, good plant science, and good operating practices and know-how, unfortunately, the industry has kind of gone in the opposite direction. So emphasizing, the technology component for me is incredibly important, but all of the other things that I've mentioned there around operating, prior operating experience, the R&D element, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot, and continuous plant science is incredibly important. At Vertical Future, we've, Innovate UK grants, we've won, I think, 10 or 12 in the last couple of years, focusing on anything from plant proteins, looking at interesting crops like amaranth, also looking at different use cases, so working with pharmaceuticals, but then going back to the core issue of food and water security. I haven't mentioned water, but I don't think you can have a food-related discussion without talking about water. We've done a lot of very interesting pioneering research in that as well. So they're kind of our core principles, and I think that's how we've set about our business. And then probably the last point is, from a data standpoint, the future success of vertical farming really comes down to data. We look at a vertical farm as a long-term infrastructure asset. This is not, something that you're going to build and then, knock down in 5 years. We look at, we use a lot of high-grade stainless steel, for example, 50-year useful life, 80% recyclability in our systems. We build our systems so that they have, they're intelligent, smart systems. We don't use terms like machine learning and AI because we're only just starting to approach that, and I think that these are buzzwords that people like to jump on. There's been obviously a lot of unsubstantiated claims in the sector, and also a lot of greenwashing as well, and we really try and avoid that. But the point about the vertical farm being a long-term infrastructure asset, if you don't have the software that's collecting the data alongside the hardware across that time period, then aside from advancements in know-how and operating practices, that farm's really not going to be more productive. And if you don't have the plant science behind that, and we have a team that works day in, day out, 10 PhD plant scientists all focused on different themes from strawberries to genetics, then again, you're not going to be increasing that baseline, increasing those yields, bringing the cost of goods sold down, and improving margins.
Could you talk a little bit about the kind of data that is being captured? So what do you mean about data in a vertical farm context, just for the wider audience?
So I try and stray away from claims, but we believe we have the most automated vertical farm in the world in terms of joining up all of the different elements. So everything from automated seeding through to automated germination, through to robotics in the system, where you don't have to actually send operators into the system unless they're doing kind of maintenance, periodic maintenance or so on, or if there's a particular issue. So in terms of that, all of our trays, we grow on 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter trays. They're barcode tracked. They continually move through the system. And we're tracking literally across a 25-day growing cycle, literally, I would say, in the high hundreds of thousands, if not millions of data points on that. Anything from temperature and humidity to space efficiency to density. So density and how you play with that over time as plants grow is very important. Lighting regime. So we have a very sophisticated lighting solution which has 5 different types of LEDs, RGB, far red, and UVB. UVB is a very interesting component as well, and can do things for plant health. So yeah, I mean, it's that, but it's also tracking a lot of data points around how you operate the farm. So understanding from a food safety standpoint, for example, if, for example, you work with a big supermarket or any off-taker, if there's an issue with a product or a recall, we know when those seeds came in, how they were treated, who was on site at the time, how long the plants were grown for, and who came in contact with them, and then everything downstream. And it's really our SaaS platform, Diana, that allows us to do that. So again, to reiterate the point, without that, the data, productivity in these long-term infrastructure assets will not improve. And my concern is a lot of the vertical farms, you know, we've heard some big deals announced and so on at COP and before, and I'm sure there'll be more, do not address integration and data enough. And we really need to look out for that.
Just perhaps to sort of bring it a little bit more onto the science perspective, what's your view first, Jamie, around what vertical farms from a climate change perspective seek to address into the bigger climate change question? And then across to Professor Gideon to understand beyond vertical farms in the wider farming ecosystems, what are some of the challenges principally being affected from a science element around in the UK and other systems around climate change impacts on the broader farming sector?
Yeah, and apologies, I sometimes brush over the core benefits of vertical farming because it's talked about so much that I assume that everybody knows. Clearly, water efficiency is a big piece. The ability to grow.
And what do you mean by water efficiency in terms of the comparator?
Well, I mean, we've done life cycle assessments, which we're going to be publishing in recognized peer-reviewed journals. There's not enough data sharing in this sector because it's predominantly private companies, which is where you get a lot of the greenwashing claims and things coming in. Every vertical farming company that sets up typically says that they use 95% less water than broadacre farming, but that's just a number that's typically taken from other vertical farms before them.
And is nice and round.
And is nice and round. The reality of it is it really depends on which crops you're growing, because you know, if you're growing more mature crops that are going to obviously you know, the rate of transpiration is going to be more, you're going to be using more energy, you're going to be using more water, and you can't recover everything. Some water leaves. Water evidently is going to leave, or a percentage of it, with the crops. Yeah. You can't recover all of it, but the systems are set up to recover as much water as possible and treat it, and then reuse it as much as possible. So water is a really big piece, and especially for this region, you know, for the GCC markets, it's absolutely critical. Energy as well, using different types of wavelengths of light. Playing with the circadian rhythm of the plant throughout its growing process. We've found through extensive research that, you know, for different types of crops, we're reducing energy inputs by 30-40% and getting yield gains on the other side, 30-40% increases, which is incredible when you think about it. And that's really the power of a vertical farm, the ability to do that. But to address your point more directly, I should say that vertical farms are very geography dependent. All these technologies I've spoken about in our systems are not going to work in the middle of Africa, for example, and are not really required. Or actually they would work, but the capex would be too high. There may not be a match between the types of crops that would be required and so on. There's a natural limitation in terms of the type of crops that can be grown economically and at price parity in vertical farms at the minute. Obviously a big focus on leafy greens, whole head lettuces, strawberries, tomatoes, and so on. And then there's obviously the pharmaceutical and nutraceutical elements. But the kind of the elephant in the room is grains. So, you know, as humans, we get 48% of our energy from grains. Ukraine, we know what's going on there. It's a breadbasket of Europe. There are massive issues around this area, and will be in the future. And this will continue to get worse and worse. And the reality is, we are quite a way away from growing things like wheat and barley at an economic price point. And claims to the contrary are incorrect. We work with some of the top researchers in the world on wheat, and it really is a challenge and is something that we'd like to tackle in the long term, but you need huge farms, pretty much free energy, pretty much free water, and then probably a toned down version of the systems that we build, but obviously, things like the light elements still left within the system. So
Much like arable farming then, free light, free water.
yes,
Yeah.
but again, arable farming or broadacre farming is again going to become more and more challenging to grow grains and other crops across the world. I mean, even if you look at the UK, we import a lot of our kind of salads from southern Spain, and they have massive water issues there. They're literally piping water down from northern Spain, and you can see this from space, that these drying out. We're getting our herbs from Kenya, and the same can be said for most geographies, but again, the point is it's really geography dependent, energy dependent, and water dependent whether or not a vertical farm is going to work. And maybe the last point is, it's interesting to see, at the beginning I mentioned what's been happening in the market. We're seeing more and more integration with other types of CEA and broadacre farming. So for example, integrating with glasshouses and doing the nursery process. Integrate it, and then obviously potentially following on and using those crops that have been grown in a vertical farm earlier on to then put outside. So I think that there's collaboration happening, and a standalone vertical farm doesn't work everywhere. But I really see that as a positive sign, and opens up more opportunities.
You didn't mention pesticides in.
Pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, it is an obvious point for us. It's if you're growing in a controlled environment and you have the proper safety protocols, and it's very much conditional also on how your staff behave, and they're not bringing things into the facility. If they're doing that, we don't use herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. It's very, very important. I said at the beginning, I'm a health economist, so if you look at some of the data from broadacre farms in emerging markets, like some countries in Africa, it's horrific, the impact on humans, and birth defects, coming from herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and so on. So clearly that is a very strong value proposition that is going to remain within vertical farms, but you still have to have very good operational practices in order to make that work.
So from a vertical farming system, the impacts, the support from relative to some of the climate change issues, clearly a far lower usage of a scarce resource in water. Clearly next to no usage of or no usage of herbicides or pesticides, and an unverified fact I picked up yesterday was 70% of the insect population in a number of countries is been wiped out in the last 2 years, but that's not a fact-checked one. Maybe Professor Gideon can come in from it. So no herbicides, a far more efficient use of water, and much more certainty in the production all year round of the food systems are certainly some of the elements the vertical farms looks to be able to support. So
I think just last point before, sorry, I don't want to take the whole panel. So another claim is food miles. The reality is, when we've conducted our life cycle assessments, if you look at the carbon savings by growing closer to the end consumers in terms of food mile savings, let's call it that. That's actually, it's good, it's positive, but it's actually only a very small percentage of the actual carbon that is used in vertical farms. We typically will conduct LCAs over a 20-year or 10-year time horizon, and we do cradle to grave. So we look at the costs of actually manufacturing the system and all the components, everything that goes into the LEDs and all that, and then obviously the food mile elements and then the operating of the farm. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to everybody that the biggest source of increases in carbon is effectively through the lighting and the operating of the farm. So it's really the success from a carbon-based standpoint in terms of addressing climate-related goals really depends on where you get your energy. If you're just buying from the grid, the numbers don't look great. But if you're getting from long-term PPAs through wind or solar, and again, this goes back to geography and what works in which regions, it works very, very well. And we look forward to showing those results.
I think the last one was food waste, that by being local, there is far less food waste because it's travelled less distance, I guess, is the other element of the food miles piece. So those are the benefits that a vertical farm brings to some of the impacts around climate change. In a bigger context, Professor Gideon, if you could just share some of your insights, some of the work you're doing within DEFRA around some of the elements of climate change and the impacts to more broader farming systems, and that potentially helps put in context where a vertical farm has a role to play.
Yeah, certainly, I can happy to do that. First of all, picking up on the food miles issue, that is very often the case. The carbon emissions from production far exceed the carbon emissions from transport, and most life cycle analysis points to that in most systems. It's a bit of a myth that transport distance makes as big a difference as it is often thought to. But I did want to broaden the conversation a little bit and think about the climate challenge, how I see it scientifically, and then also something about what the UK is doing in this space. Okay, thank you. I'll move it a bit closer. Yeah. Good. And the feedback has gone. Thank you. So Mark has already mentioned that something like a third of global emissions of greenhouse gases come from the agricultural system. We also know that agriculture is by far the biggest source of biodiversity loss on the planet, and it also drives substantial pollution issues with wide consequences for human and environmental health. And this means we are going to have to fundamentally change our agricultural systems as we go into the future. And that's made even worse by the fact that the growing population now exceeds 8 billion and continues to grow. So we have a triple challenge. We need to solve climate, we need to solve biodiversity, we need to feed a growing population, and we need to do all those three in the light of a changing climate that's making it harder to do all of them. So this is the big challenge that we face. One of the ways this is really going to play out is through pressure on land use. And if you look at the UK as an example, the UK has 24 million hectares of total land area. Our government assessment suggests that because of the need to grow more trees, restore peat, grow biomass for fuel, and restore habitats for biodiversity, we need to spare about 2 million of that total 24 hectares of land for those environmental benefits. And that means to maintain food supply or to grow it, we absolutely need systems that are going to be more productive, can make more from less area, and do so with less environmental damage. So this is the challenge that we face. When we face these sorts of challenges in the past, we have solved them with science. There's been a very tight coupling between land use and food production and population through all of human history until about the middle of the 20th century. And it was broken then by two big scientific discoveries, by the Haber-Bosch process to make artificial fertilizers, and by genetics, Borlaug and others working out how we could harness genetics to make better crops. So those are the revolutions that have enabled us to feed 8 billion people. How are we now going to feed a growing population on a planet with climate change, which we need to tackle? And I think there are 5 broad areas of science we need to think about, or some areas where science needs to feed in to this future innovation landscape. First of all, on tech, perhaps I call it traditional tech, and this includes things like the vertical farms that we've been talking about already. It includes precision agriculture, robotics and automation more generally, including care about our water and nutrient systems, as Jamie and Mark have touched on already, and much better care in our greenhouse gas management, for instance using methane scrubbers and other processes during livestock agricultural systems. But often when we say tech, what we think of are those sorts of technologies. Increasingly, I think what we're going to need is my second category, biotech. We're absolutely going to need to look more at the biological side of our systems. We need to harness the genetic information and knowledge that we are now getting to make better varieties of our crops and also to make better use of the something like 7,000 edible food species that are on the planet, of which we only ever eat about 400. There's loads of species we can explore, many of which might be amenable to growing in vertical farm systems. So we need to make better use of those genetic systems, as well as looking at the biotech of nutrient cycles and the biotech of better pesticides, herbicides, and equivalent. The third point is around diversity of system. What we need to be resilient to climate change in the future is to be more diverse in the way that we farm. Get away from just the traditional systems, though they maintain their importance, and look at other ways of doing it. Vertical farming is important in this context, but aquaculture has a bigger role to play, and there are other systems we might bring more into play, such as insect bioconversion as a way of recycling within the food system. I've talked about systems a lot, and that's my fourth area where we really need to see innovation. People get used to farming in a particular way and making food in a particular way. They have a system. That's the way they've often done it for generations. We need to move people from just those systems into new systems. It's not just a case of innovating within a system, but sometimes developing entirely new systems for how we grow our food. And moving some of our agriculture indoor requires just that sort of thinking, that systems approach to how we grow food for the growing population. And fifth, and finally, behavioural science is really important here. People are going to have to change. We need to eat less in most of the developed world, tackling the obesity challenge. We need to throw away less. We need to eat more healthily. And we need to be communicating this and really convincing people in the community, but also the people who grow the food, the farmers, people who produce the food, and the whole retail system as well, about a need for that behavioural change, which involves a lot of science. It certainly involves the data side that Jamie has been talking about. So briefly, just before I finish, Mark, let me say a few words about the type of activity that UK government is doing to encourage science in these areas. We have a core evidence programme that seeks to make sure we get the evidence we need for agricultural innovation. One that I'll call on here is our genetic improvement networks that have been investing heavily over many years now to understand the genetic variability that happens naturally during breeding systems so that we can harness that variability for better varieties. Many important new crop varieties have come from that genetic improvement network system. We work closely with funding agencies on the discovery side in the UK so that we can harness completely novel ideas and bring them into agriculture. And our land use and net zero programme, which is now running, is a good example of that, specifically trying to use innovation to solve the climate challenge. We also have the Farm Innovation Programme, investing 270 million over 7 years to really work with small, medium enterprises and sometimes bigger industry to make sure that we can drive innovation all the way through to market and see it happen on the farm. And that programme has invested heavily in technological solutions, including vertical farming. And increasingly, we're investing in DEFRA in our UK aid budget to see research and innovation feed through into developments in the lower and middle income countries that can innovate in those sectors as well. I certainly recognise the importance of vertical farming in that landscape. There are lots of other technologies and biotechnologies that we also need to use, but we need them in a system that involves the vertical farming.
Yeah. Jamie, there's a couple of points in there that I think are worth bringing out in some elements of what is working on sort of Professor Gideon's comments there just on the biotech element and the innovations looking forward, but also the innovations looking back. So two good examples about how the system itself helps create those innovations. Maybe you talk a little bit about what we've done with spinach, but then also talk a little bit about the research that Jen has been doing about amaranth as an alternative crop that isn't otherwise grown, that has a number of health benefits that are worth understanding. So if you could, without me taking all of your thunder with those questions, talk a little bit about that, and I think that really helps illustrate one very big point that you were making there about the sort of the biotechnology adaptation.
Sure. So I think on the spinach point that Mark's referring to, so we did a government-funded project with a couple of different, as you do in all of these. The good thing about innovation grants and many of the other interesting programs that were just mentioned is it brings different types of organizations together. And obviously, in the vertical farming sector, it's predominantly, private closed door approach. People don't share, very much data, but getting the opportunity to work with, organizations like the National Institute for Agricultural Botany in the UK, a key partner of ours, and different types of universities has been really critical. So, so for the spinach piece and what Mark was referring to about innovation not always being forward, but also looking back, we actually we found a spinach variety.
Just for everybody's benefit, the reason spinach is an interesting crop from our perspective.
It's horrible. Yeah, I mean, not horrible
on
to
taste. Taste-wise?
No, it tastes lovely, especially ours. But spinach is one of the most high in demand crops in most geographies. Very, very low yields. A lot of issues around bacteria. I think we were getting seeds in and testing them, and I think 7 out of 10 of them on average had different types of bacteria, and also very low pricing. So everything's really working against you. So this is why we actually chose spinach as the crop to focus on. And there were multiple, so for this particular project, there were multiple things that we looked at. So we looked at things like cold plasma seed treatment, so that you could actually almost zap the seeds.
What does that mean? Why would you?
It's not our technology. It's with another company, but they were obviously involved in the grant. But it's effectively a machine where you put the seeds in, and typically farms, when they treat seeds, use pretty nasty chemicals to do that. Cold plasma seed treatment, without knowing all of the details for it, is literally, as I said, it's like zapping the seeds, and that sterilizes them. So that was the first element of that. But the second, for me, the more interesting element of that, and when I mentioned innovation looking back, we went, we accessed the seed bank, and we found a variety of spinach. And this goes back to the point around variety selection, which I think was 400 years old. And we found, just through using that variety, we were getting a 3-fold or 4-fold increase in yields. That is, it's tremendous. It's game-changing. So overnight, you have a product which is notoriously difficult. Most vertical farms don't even touch it, or if they do touch it, they're going to be charging a huge premium for it, which, going back to my point, they shouldn't be doing. So really, really interesting.
And why wasn't that seed currently in use in the broadacre farming community? Was it something about an indoor environment that it flourished? What was the sort of the base genesis of why?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I think that obviously seed suppliers have their preferred seeds, right? And that's a whole different business. Okay. And I think the way that we went about it is independent of that. We looked at seed bank and just figured out new ways forward. Yeah. And then your second point, I think you asked about the amaranth. Amaranth is a very interesting crop. Typically not consumed apart from things like if you're sprinkling microgreens in Michelin-style restaurants and so on. But if you grow it to full size, it has a very high protein content, which I think is up to about 40%. So higher than chicken and beef, I believe. So very interesting use case, and we're working with a partner in the UK to potentially use that as a for the kind of alternative protein market, for vegans and vegetarians and so on. So still working on the unit economics around that to see if that works, because if you for example have a fake burger, or I don't want to use any company burger. Names on names. Sorry,
fake meat.
Fake meat, yes. Meat replacement.
Yeah.
Tasty vegetarian
Thank you. That's the
equivalents.
scientific
Yes.
answer.
Typically that is based on pea proteins, and some people are allergic. Some people don't like the taste of pea, we're looking at other ways forward. So yeah, a few good examples of how we've used our systems and science to really look at that as well.
is it worth just talking a little bit about strawberries as another element of using genetic seed banks and that process about, again, where that level of innovation on the biotech piece is playing a role in what we're doing?
So everybody wants to buy strawberries in pretty much every market. It's very popular. We have an in-house, PhD strawberry scientist. We do work every day on things like pollination. Pollination is one of the really critical elements to growing indoors. So actually looking at alternatives to bees. Bees get lost and very confused by different types of lights. So for example, you have to kind of, gradually fade the LEDs when it's time for the bees to go to sleep and find their home in the farm. And of course, they die and then could end up in the product. So lot focused on that, but the success of strawberries in any market really comes down to the supply chain and the variety selection that the variety of strawberries that you're able to access. That's going to be the critical factor in determining success for that particular product moving forward.
I think I might mention at this point some of the work using gene editing to build better crop varieties. And first of all, to mention that the UK, for those who may not be aware, UK earlier this year passed legislation to make gene editing much easier to use for crop development in the UK and taking crops to market. So the Genetic Technologies Precision Breeding Act passed this year. One of the things we've been able to do as a consequence of leaving the EU. And one of the things that we're working on quite hard in that area in some parts of the industry is development of better products that meet consumer need. There are lots of benefits of precision breeding, including environmental and health benefits. But it's interesting to me that some of the things that are first reaching market are products that have been built because there's consumer demand for it. And the first gene-edited crop to reach market in the US is specifically a leafy green developed because it's been gene-edited to remove the bitter flavour from that crop. So although you can normally eat it only by cooking, it's now a salad ingredient, and that's been what's driven this particular company. Again, I'm avoiding mentioning company names at your request, but they've developed a particular product specifically because of consumer demand for new salad ingredients. So use of some of our understanding of genetics will enable us to build crops that not only better for the environment, but better for human consumption and what they want.
And back to your point about the question we made earlier about some of the science and the data that we collect, I think there's really interesting things to take place, not just through the gene editing piece, but maybe, Jamie, you talk a little bit about how we can adapt morphology, adapt taste around the different lighting regimes that we have within the farm itself. So just if you talk a little bit about that, I think the combination of not only making genetic modifications to the crop, but also then changing the manner in which light regimes and nutrient regimes can with precision change taste, I think is an interesting adaptation. But
so going back to my point before, lighting, LED lighting is at the center of any vertical farm, and having a basic cheap lighting solution is a very typical way that a lot of people go, and it's a fundamental error. You need a really adaptive, flexible lighting solution, again, so that you can almost play tricks on plants to grow in particular ways. So in terms of morphology, the shape of the crop, we can influence that through different types of lighting regimes and what we call them growing algorithms that will just develop more and more over time. Nutritional content, and a lot of that also links back to nutrient solutions that we're using as well. But light, does have a pretty substantive impact on nutrient density as well. If you think about things like strawberries as well, you can increase the Brix content, so the sweetness of a strawberry, by using different types of lighting. And then, of course, taste, which should be front and center, depending on who you talk to. Certainly lighting must be the core area of focus for any vertical farms moving forward, and is where we conduct most of our transformational R&D. And I should also say that this is never going to stop, because if we're going to be rolling out not just vertical farms, but wider CEA, so for example, productive greenhouses, the number of permutations you can have, we're talking about billions of different types of tests and growing algorithms for different types of crops. It's going to take a long time to do that, a lot of money. So this idea that I do worry about meeting targets through using CEA in the short term, because I see it on the ground. I talk to our plant scientists, and it doesn't matter how much money you have and you're throwing at it. Research takes time, and it's really something that you can't rush. But we're very, very confident that over time, through these technologies, we'll get better and better crop economics.
As a potential,
so I have to make the argument that you can't rush research with my ministers really quite frequently, and often the argument stems from a seasonal problem, in that you can't do research on anything that grows without going through the seasonal cycle and seeing it. Of course, you're somewhat out of that loop. Yep. You can grow things more quickly inside, but just to come in and say it's still, I totally support your view that you can't rush research, you can't deliver it next week. It takes a long-term view, and you've got to be strategic with what you do. So I welcome your comments.
And we're in an environment where we feel like we have to rush, which is the constant.
Well, we do have a deadline because of climate change. And we do need to see innovation that happens and delivers carbon savings and greater adaptation really quickly. Yeah. So there is a rush. We are still limited by just how fast we can do things.
And I'm only going to briefly touch on it because it's an incredibly controversial topic, but the ability to bring GM modified crops in an environment, in a closed environment of a vertical farm, does offer a pretty interesting way to test out GM modified crop types in a manner that you can control their ability to not go into the wider ecosystem beyond it. But
so I'll start with something simple,
go on.
because I've got the microphone. I'll start by saying that in the UK we have no intention to change the GM legislation at the moment. We've made a step change to allow gene editing through the Precision Breeding Act. We want to let that bed in and see how that works before. There's no intention at the present to think about GM as a next step. But it is already possible in the UK to do testing of GM products in controlled environments. Yeah. Often that's done in a laboratory or institute research environment, but I think you're right that doing it in a controlled vertical farm environment would be a scale up, but still not allowing those products into the environment where some of the concerns that people have about them may become a problem.
Yeah. And then,
Yeah, just I think you've made the point, but there's a distinct difference between gene editing and GMO, and I think I think a lot of the general public aren't aware of that, and I think there would be a significant pushback. Correct me if I'm wrong. If GMO were to come to the UK.
I think we need to be very careful to take the public with us on this. The polling that we've done in the UK, and I think this is true in many countries, around gene editing has been that the public are quite positive, especially for crops. A bit wavery for livestock, but very much so for crops. We haven't done the same sort of polling on GM, but certainly there's a perception that there'll be more hostility to transgenic and transgenic sorts of approaches. So we're going slowly and methodically with this.
And as we draw it to a close, one of the other points you made, Professor, was around the ecosystem elements. Maybe back to, I was going to pass it to Jamie since you had the mic, but I think the ecosystem is an incredibly important element to look at these things, because there is not one size fits all. There is not one single solution. We do not have a magic bullet to be able to utilize. Jamie, if you could talk a little bit around the way in which vertical farms work in ecosystems, whether that be for some of the other things vertical farms do around nurseries for the wider greenhouses, but equally about some of the other ways in which vertical farms are being used in around the sapling production for trees as well. So just the other crops essentially.
Sure. So it's a bit of a clearly we can do pharma, we can do nutraceutical, and we have carried out projects in that space, but that's completely aside really from the focus of COP28 really. So I think we should probably avoid those topics for now. But in terms of the tree sapling reference, it's very interesting because we've been doing a lot of research and life cycle analysis, which we're going to get independently verified. We've been working with a company now for 2.5 years and looking at using a vertical farm as effectively a tree nursery to keep up with tree planting targets for major estates in the UK and more broadly. This is a real growth market. It's going to be something that's going to be supported by carbon credits. It kind of, if you presented the idea to kind of a member of the general public, it doesn't seem to make sense that if you are using all this power to grow these trees and then you planted them outside, why wouldn't you just do it through traditional means? But the fact of the matter is, through using traditional means, quite often plants lose a lot of their resiliency, and the company we're working with found that within the first year they were losing up to 80% of the trees that they were planting. We can grow these trees in 3 months in a vertical farm, and we can pump out loads of them because they're just at nursery stage. We can use the technologies, the lighting and other elements to protect them. So it's a bit like raising a child. When child's very young, you need to look after it a lot more, and then you let it out into the wild. Not too early, but I can only speak for my 3 kids at home. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it. Really interesting use case, and it will address. We've actually found that we can reduce carbon depending on the expected lifespan of that tree once it's obviously then been planted in the wilderness.
And I think the key piece that absolutely blew my mind away was the results that have been found to date, and they're 1.5 years, 2 years into the trial. The estate they were planting them was having that 80% loss, and in their first year of having put the vertically grown saplings in, they haven't yet lost a single tree in that process. So in terms of reforestation elements, it makes a phenomenal difference from that perspective. And then lastly, before we draw this to a close, maybe just talk about the way in which that same nursery concept works in big greenhouses, and to the professor's point about using the space that we have more efficiently.
So greenhouses I've visited, even the low-tech or high-tech ones, I've visited greenhouses all over the world, typically are not very space efficient. They don't, they could do a lot more, and I think a lot of the space that is used, granted, you're getting free energy basically from the sun, but actually if you integrate a vertical farm into the earlier stages of the growing process, i.e. you've got the germination and then the effective stage 1, you can then transplant those, spread them out, put them into a greenhouse, and make the greenhouses far more efficient, productive, and increase output substantially. And also, going back to the previous point, also have a much healthier crop. And light manipulation is obviously very critical for that as well. So again, another very interesting use case.
If we've still got time, if there are any questions in the audience, I'll maybe open it up to anybody else, or are we okay for one or two if one exists? There's a nodding. There looks like there's nodding. Yes. Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yes.
Halim Benaj from Arab Authority for Agriculture Investment and Development. First of all, thank you for inviting us for this event. And I would like to have thought of Mr. Jimmy about the future in investing in vertical farming, because we have seen in many hypermarket. Now they have their own small room of vertical farming, and they sell their products. So what do you think about the investment in the future after 10 days? Is the investment will be in big farming for vertical farming, or in small unit, the future of vertical farming is?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm going to completely rubbish those models. They're
Which models?
They're purely for marketing. So
The small model, the small.
So first of all, retail space in any supermarket is expensive, right? So the idea of growing a plant through to maturity in that space, which actually doesn't happen in most cases, although there are some. I don't know, there are some companies in the US and so on that have, these small growing systems in restaurants and supermarkets and so on. It's a marketing ploy, really. It's not really doing much to address the much more kind of grandiose goals that need to be achieved. The reality is the future of vertical farming and wider CEA will happen in peri-urban and rural areas where you have connections to energy, land is cheaper. Transporting a product in 100 miles is still way better than thousands of miles flying crops in from from North Africa or wherever. So and there'll be large-scale farms. So but as I said at the beginning of this discussion, unfortunately, because of the capital markets, people have shut in some regions. Investors have got a bit shaky need, and they want a small pilot first or something, of maybe 1,000 square meters to if you to be able to demonstrate that the technology works and the yields work. And unfortunately, that wastes time, right? We need to speed things up, and building a farm and then going through that process to prove to the investors and the end client, can take up to 2 years before you then scale. So we really need action now. And so what we try and do is we provide independently verified studies on our systems. We provide our yields. We invite people in to actually see and substantiate, what we're pitching to them and so on. From an investor standpoint, we're seeing a complete shift. So infrastructure investors who they're looking at vertical farming like they looked at the solar market many years ago. Happier to have slower, longer returns, 8% yield, let's say, 10-year exit horizon, and so on. We shy completely away from the VCs and the PEs who have unreasonable expectations in terms of these short exit horizons.
And we've built big and we've built small. But our job is to fill the space that somebody has, and we see very challenged economic models of small farms, and we see very healthy returns from the scale that you get of building large farms. So we will build for whoever wants to buy from us in that context. If someone's coming to us with a small farm, we do point out the difficulty they're going to have in actually making economic returns because of the lack of those scale that you get on that smaller farm. Which I think brings us to the conclusion. Thank you very much for everybody that has sat through with us. We hope we entertained you, provided you a number of interesting points, and we look forward to seeing you around. So I'd like to thank very much Professor Gideon for his time and his insights. Definitely helped make the panel for us today. And thank you everybody very much for coming.